The mechanical whine of the industrial paper shredder in the mahogany-lined study of the Sterling estate didn't sound like office work. It sounded like bones snapping. Victoria stood perfectly still in the center of the cavernous room, her spine locked into a rigid, unyielding military brace. She was 18 years old, but her eyes held the flat, dangerous stillness of an operator who had already learned to suppress her pulse. On the pristine glass desk before her, the thick, heavy parchment package from the United States Air Force Academy, bearing the silver-embossed crest of the Falcon and the official appointment to the elite Night Ops Command pipeline was disappearing. Whir, crunch, slice. The crisp white sheets containing her perfect physical fitness scores, her perfect score on the Air Force officer qualifying test, and her congressional nomination were being reduced to a cascade of meaningless uniform ribbons of gray ash. Cassandra Sterling didn't look up as she fed the last page of the medical clearance into the steel teeth. She adjusted the heavy gold Cartier bracelet on her wrist, her movements fluid, practiced, and entirely devoid of human heat. To Cassandra, human beings were not flesh and blood. They were either assets to be leveraged or non-performing liabilities to be depreciated to zero. "Do not look at me with that pathetic cinematic resentment, Victoria," Cassandra said, her voice a low, cultured purr that had spent decades navigating charity galas and corporate boardrooms. She stepped away from the shredder, brushing a microscopic speck of paper dust from her tailored cream trousers. "A mother does not rob a child of a future. A mother simply corrects a bad investment before it drains the family's credit score." "That appointment was earned, Cassandra," Victoria said. Her voice didn't shake. It was too quiet, carrying the low, vibrating frequency of a jet turbine idling on a freezing tarmac. "I placed top of the national list. I spent 4 years running miles in the freezing rain while your daughter Fiona was hungover in Milan. I cleared the psychological evaluation with a perfect resilience index. I earned that seat." Cassandra finally raised her eyes. They were the color of stagnant harbor water, pale cold, and utterly dead to the human cost of her ambitions. "You earned a delusion," Cassandra corrected, leaning her hip against the edge of the glass desk, crossing her arms with an air of supreme, unearned authority. "A Sterling woman does not sweat through Nomex flight suits. A Sterling woman does not crawl through the mud of Colorado Springs to be yelled at by grease monkeys who make less in a year than we spend on a weekend in Aspen. You are a girl, Victoria. Your utility to this name does not lie in the cockpit of a combat machine. Your utility lies in your pelvis, your bloodline, and your immediate alignment with a Wall Street banking house that can inject capital into our failing logistics division." She gestured dismissively toward the open French doors where the distant airy sound of a harp was drifting from the sunroom. "Your sister Fiona understands her obligations. She is currently reviewing the prenuptial frameworks for the Vanguard merger. By the time she is 24, she will occupy the permanent chairman's seat on the executive board. That is leverage. That is architecture. You..." Cassandra let out a short, mocking breath that was sharper than a razor. "You are a financial drain. An ongoing line item of overhead expense that I have spent nearly 2 decades trying to balance out. If you think I will allow you to squander our social credit on some hyper-masculine patriotic rebellion disguised as public service, you are out of your mind." "It isn't a rebellion," Victoria whispered, her hands clenching behind her back until the skin over her knuckles threatened to split. "It's my life." "It is whatever I write into the ledger," Cassandra replied, already turning her back, picking up her leather-bound iPad to review the morning's market indices. "The car will be ready at 6 tomorrow morning to take you to the bridal dress fitting in Manhattan. Do not be late. You already look remarkably plain. Let us not add unpunctual to your invoice." Victoria didn't argue. She had learned long ago that trying to reason with Cassandra Sterling was like trying to argue with a descending heavy press. It didn't listen, it just crushed. She executed a sharp, silent pivot on her heels and walked out of the study, her canvas sneakers leaving no sound on the imported marble. The storm hit the Long Island coast at midnight, a howling black water gale that rattled the heavy sash windows of the Sterling mansion and turned the Atlantic into a churning cauldron of white foam. In the dark of her third-floor room, Victoria didn't light a candle. She didn't need one. She packed with the fast mechanical efficiency of a saboteur. Her belongings were few. Cassandra had always strictly policed her wardrobe, ensuring she only wore restrictive tailored silks, designed to project her stepmother's wealth rather than her own comfort. But tucked away behind the cedar backing of her closet were two olive-drab, heavy canvas military rucksacks. They were stiff-smelling of old zinc cosmoline and dried Atlantic salt. They had belonged to her grandfather, a retired master sergeant who had died before Cassandra could scrub his memory from the house. He had been the only person to ever look at Victoria's unyielding stance and say, "They're trying to build a cage for you, little bird. Don't you dare forget that the wind doesn't belong to the people with the checkbooks." Inside the bags, she packed only the essentials: 3 sets of heavy cotton undershirts, 2 pairs of rugged denim jeans, her broken-in steel-toe boots, and a small waterproof case containing her legal documents, her birth certificate, passport, and social security card, which she had quietly retrieved from Cassandra's filing cabinet weeks ago in anticipation of this breaking point. At the very bottom of the second bag, she placed her grandfather's old silver dog tags. They clinked together in the darkness, a lonely, rhythmic, metallic sound against the roaring of the wind outside. She didn't leave a note. A note was an admission of contact. A note gave them a vector to track. Victoria slipped down the back service stairs, bypassing the security grid she had spent the last 6 months cataloging and mapping. When she pushed open the iron cellar door and stepped out into the teeth of the gale, the rain hit her face like a handful of gravel. It was freezing wet and violent, stripping away the suffocating perfume of the Sterling mansion within seconds. She walked down the mile-long gravel driveway, the 2 heavy canvas bags pulling at her shoulders, never once looking back at the lights of the house, where she had been treated as nothing more than a depreciating asset. As the heavy iron perimeter gates clicked shut behind her, she felt a terrifying, beautiful void open in her chest. She was 18 years old, entirely alone, completely cut off from billions of dollars, and finally completely unbound. The transition from the manicured silence of the Sterling estate to the screaming industrial hell of Air Force night ops selection at Lackland and Fort Rucker was a brutal physical execution of her old identity. If Cassandra Sterling had spent 18 years trying to break Victoria's spirit through psychological starvation, the military tried to break her body through unyielding friction. The air at the training camps was a thick, swampy soup of humidity smelling of hot, JP-8 jet fuel-scorched rubber, and the collective sweat of 60 recruits pushing themselves into structural failure. "Move, you useless piece of meat! Move!" The instructor's voice roared in her ear, his breath hot against her temple as she held a 70-pound log above her head in the pouring rain. "Is your daddy a senator, recruit? Did your mommy buy your way out of the mud? Because out here, your name isn't worth the fabric it's printed on." Victoria didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked on a microscopic knot in the pine wood above her face. Sweat and red dirt ran into her eyes, burning them raw, but her internal pulse remained a flat, steady rhythm. Every time her muscles screamed, every time her lungs felt like they were filling with wet concrete during the survival swimming trials, she heard the whir of the shredder. She saw the silver crest of the Air Force turning into ribbons. She didn't just pass the courses, she hunted them, while the other candidates wept in their bunks at night, wrapping their bleeding shins and treating friction burns. Victoria sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, using a low-intensity red flashlight to memorize the hydraulic schematics of the MH-60M Blackhawk. She studied the aerodynamic properties of rotary wing flight until the math felt like her native language. She pushed herself into the Elite Night Systems Command Pipeline, a dark, highly classified sector of Special Operations Aviation that chewed up and spit out 95% of its applicants, nearly all of them seasoned male combat veterans. They called her the Shadow on the flight line. She didn't participate in the weekend drinking sessions when they got base liberty. She didn't have a phone. She didn't write letters. She had no home to report to. Her home was the maintenance hangar, the cold metallic smell of hydraulic fluid, and the green phosphor glow of Generation 4 night vision goggles. By the time she earned her wings and her secret commission, her fingers were no longer soft or manicured. They were rough, calloused, scarred from slipping crescent wrenches and sharp aluminum rivets. Her skin was hardened by the desert sun of Nellis and the freezing winds of Alaska. Her eyes had lost the guarded defensive look of an abused stepchild. They were the eyes of a master pilot who had learned to command the dark. November 12th, 2024. The Malacca Strait. Altitude 45 feet over water. The cockpit of the stealth MH-60M Pavehawk was a chamber of absolute chaos wrapped in a green tint. Hydraulic pressure low system 1 failure. The automated voice chimed in Victoria's headset, its synthetic female cadence completely disconnected from the heavy machine gun fire tearing through the night sky. "Hold it together, girl," Victoria muttered through her oxygen mask, her boots working the anti-torque pedals with savage, precise micro-inputs. They were flying completely blacked out, no navigation lights, no radar signatures, skimming so close to the black violent swells of the Malacca Strait that the rotor wash was throwing salt spray directly onto her armored windshield. A 4-man maritime reconnaissance team had been ambushed on a hijacked container vessel by a heavily armed maritime militia group. The ship was a maze of steel containers, crawling with anti-aircraft positions, and a massive tropical squall had knocked out all conventional carrier-based support. Victoria's helicopter was the only asset close enough to make the window before the team was executed on the open deck. "Captain, the main hydraulic line is bleeding out," her co-pilot yelled, his hands shaking against his cyclic stick as a burst of 23mm tracer rounds tore through the night sky, missing their rotor blades by less than 6 feet. "We've got an internal fire in the aft compartment. The flight controls are going stiff. We need to pull up and punch out over open water." "Negative, Lieutenant." Victoria snapped her voice, cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "The moment we pull up, their radar locks onto us and we're a fireball. Keep us in the spray." Through her night vision visor, she could see the target ship, a massive rusting leviathan of steel wallowing in the waves. On the helipad at the stern, 3 American operators were firing their final rounds, their bodies silhouetted against the flash of incoming rocket-propelled grenades. One man was already down, being dragged toward the edge by his team leader. "Setting up for a hard deck hover," Victoria commanded, her brain dropping into that cold, absolute stillness where the aircraft became an extension of her own nervous system. She swung the massive, heavily modified stealth helicopter sideways, exposing her armored belly to the hostile gunners on the bridge deck to shield the rescue zone. The wind tore at the damaged tail rotor, trying to force the machine into a fatal spin against the ship's cranes, but Victoria's adjustments were telepathic, brutal, and flawlessly executed. Thud! The left landing gear touched the slick, blood-stained steel of the helipad. The rest of the aircraft hung over the roaring whitewater wake of the ship. Go extract!" she roared into the intercom. Through her side window, she watched her crew chief drag the 3 battered, bleeding operators through the cabin door. Just as the last man cleared the threshold, an explosive round punched through the right side of her engine cowl, severing the secondary hydraulic lines completely. The control sticks went rigid as concrete. The helicopter began to roll violently to the right toward the dark ocean below.
"Controls locked. We're going down,"
the co-pilot screamed, pulling his hands away from the stick to brace for impact.
"I have the aircraft,"
Victoria yelled. With the hydraulic pressure gone, she didn't try to fight the mechanical stiffness with muscle. Instead, she used the collective drop to intentionally plunge the helicopter off the edge of the ship's deck, using the sudden drop into the air pocket to force the nose down, picking up airspeed to let the aerodynamic stabilizers level the wings naturally. The black water rushed past her visor less than 5 feet below her boots before the nose finally straightened. She nursed the rattling, smoking, crippled machine through the darkness, her hands locked on the heavy controls until they reached safe airspace as the first gray light of dawn broke over the ocean. 3 weeks later, in a soundproofed, deep underground briefing room at the Pentagon, a 4-star general pinned the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, onto Victoria's dark blue uniform. "Your actions saved a critical intelligence network from total liquidation, Captain," the general said, looking at her with a solemn, profound respect. "But because of the diplomatic sensitivity of the waters and the classified nature of the airframe, this operation does not exist on the public record. Your flight logs have been scrubbed. The maintenance reports have been buried under a special access black budget wrapper. To the world, you were never there." The general studied her face, looking for any trace of anger or pride. "Does that reality trouble you, Captain?" Victoria looked down at the heavy, intricate silver cross in its velvet box. She thought of Cassandra. She thought of the sterling name that lived on headlines, public relations firms, and curated social media profiles. "No, sir," Victoria said, her voice clear, steady, and proud. "The men I pulled off that deck know I was there. The dark knows I was there. That is all the record I will ever need." The complete disconnect between her actual existence and her family's perception of it became an absolute farce during her mandatory post-deployment leave in early 2026. Following an intense 6-month operational loop, she was ordered by the command to take 2 weeks of complete downtime. Desiring to see if her father's old records had survived Cassandra's purge, she traveled back to the Northeast. She wore her formal service dress uniform immaculate and sharply pressed the silver pilot wings gleaming brightly above her rows of unreadable ribbon bars. She arrived at the Sterling estate during a massive, high-profile cocktail gala celebrating Fiona's appointment as the youngest CEO in the history of the family's maritime trust. The long driveway was choked with sleek black foreign luxury cars. When Victoria walked through the massive double doors, the senior butler, a man who had watched her grow up as an outcast, stared at her uniform with a mixture of terror and immediate discomfort. "Miss Victoria," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Your Mrs. Sterling is in the grand ballroom." Victoria walked through the archway, her heavy tactical boots making a distinct loud thump, thump, thump on the polished parquet floor, a rhythmic military intrusion that cut directly through the chamber music and the delicate clinking of crystal stemware. The laughter in her immediate vicinity died instantly. Dozens of wealthy, influential faces turned to look at the woman in the dark blue uniform. Cassandra Sterling sat on a raised sofa at the far end of the room, surrounded by hedge fund managers and real estate moguls. Her eyes narrowed into slits as they swept over Victoria's uniform, stopping for a microsecond on the silver pilot wings before hardening into pure aristocratic ice. "Victoria," Cassandra said, her voice projecting beautifully across the suddenly quiet room, pitched perfectly so every guest could catch the tone. "What an unconventional surprise. I see you are still playing your little dress-up games with the government. A few of the older men at the table chuckled indulgently, as if looking at a child who had wandered into a corporate meeting in a costume. I am on official leave, Cassandra, Victoria said, her voice level and steady. Of course you are, Cassandra said, turning back to the billionaire investor sitting beside her, her tone dripping with mock pity. You must forgive my stepdaughter, Arthur. She left our home years ago to take an administrative position down in Washington. I believe she is currently a logistics assistant for parts inventory at a naval supply depot. Someone has to keep track of the screwdrivers and the old spare tires, I suppose. It's public service after all. A polite mocking ripple of laughter went around the circle. Victoria looked across the room at Fiona, who was wearing a diamond necklace that could have funded an entire special operations squadron for a year. Her sister met her gaze with a cruel, satisfied smirk, a perfect genetic duplicate of Cassandra's arrogance. It must be dreadfully exhausting work, dear. Cassandra continued, her eyes glittering with malice. All that dust and counting old folders. If you ever tire of lifting boxes in Washington, the offer for a position in our building's basement archives is still open. We can always use someone who knows how to label boxes. Victoria felt the heavy weight of the Air Force Cross resting in the inner pocket of her jacket right against her ribs. She looked at the 70 people in the room surrounded by gold leaf silk drapes and billions of dollars of paper wealth, entirely blind to the fact that the very borders they used to protect their fortunes were being held together by the blood of people they wouldn't even allow to park their cars. She smiled. It wasn't an angry smile. It was a smile of absolute pristine detachment. They couldn't touch her anymore. Their words were just low-frequency static, completely drowned out by the memory of 2 twin-turbine engines screaming at 40 feet over a black ocean. Thank you for the offer, Cassandra, Victoria said, her voice clear, resonant, and completely devoid of the shame her stepmother so desperately wanted to see. But I find I prefer working with things that actually have a purpose. She turned on her heavy scuffed boots and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the complacent silence of the Sterling estate behind her, forever, her eyes already tracking upward toward the next storm. The air conditioning inside the VIP Obsidian Arch boardroom on the 82nd floor of Atlanta's premier financial tower didn't just cool the room, it pressurized it. The space was an architectural manifestation of raw, unchecked leverage. Double-height walls of smoked glass looked out over the sprawling, humid expanse of the Georgia afternoon, making the cars and people below look like microscopic data points on a spreadsheet. Inside, the surfaces were all black quartzite brushed titanium and sound-dampening wool. It was an environment designed explicitly to break a human being's psychological posture before a single word was spoken. Victoria stepped through the double-vaulted entryway, her arrival marked by a heavy, unyielding cadence that immediately shattered the room's curated acoustic silence. She wore her Air Force service dress uniform, the deep midnight blue fabric immaculate, sharp, and heavily structured. Across her left breast, the rows of ribbons formed a dense, vibrant mosaic of silver, gold, and deep blue, crowned by the polished silver wings of a command pilot. It was a uniform that by federal mandate demanded immediate respect in any room across the globe. But below the crisp, razor-pressed hem of her trousers, she had entirely bypassed the standard high-gloss low quarters. Instead, she wore her operational tactical boots. They were scuffed, scarred, and heavily coated with a dark, grimy crust of dried maritime brine, and the pungent chemical tang of JP-8 jet fuel, the unmistakable residue of an emergency low-altitude reconnaissance flight she had been pulled from less than 4 hours prior. Every step she took left a faint, ghostly outline of dried salt and fuel oil on the pristine white rug, a deliberate, silent intrusion of the real world into a sanctuary of sterile billions. At the far end of the immense quartzite table sat the triumvirate of her biological history. Cassandra Sterling sat dead-center, draped in an asymmetric silk suit the color of bone, her gold Cartier bracelets clicking softly against her watch as she adjusted her posture. To her right sat Fiona, balancing a crystal flute of vintage Krug champagne between two fingers, her expression radiating the supreme, unearned confidence of someone who believed she owned the very air everyone else was breathing. To Cassandra's left sat Julian Sterling. He looked older than he had during her brief holiday encounter, his silver hair slicked back tightly, his face set into a rigid mask of patriarchal fatigue, a performance of exhaustion he had long used to mask his complete moral cowardice. Flanking them like a purebred guard dog in a three-piece charcoal pinstripe suit was Richard Lawson. He was the family's chief legal architect, a man whose reputation for dismantling human lives in corporate litigation was legendary among the elite circles of Wall Street. He didn't look up when Victoria entered. He merely clicked the top of a custom matte black pen, the sound sharp as a firing pin. "Sit, Victoria," Cassandra said, not gesturing to a chair, but rather indicating a small, isolated leather seat positioned directly opposite the family beneath the harsh, focused glare of the recessed ceiling lights. "We have precisely 30 minutes before Richard's team has to lock in the final filings for the New York opening. Let us dispense with the military theater." Victoria didn't take the seat. She remained standing, her feet spaced precisely shoulder-width apart, her hands clasped loosely behind her back in a modified parade rest. Her gaze didn't rest on her stepmother or her sister. It fixed on the center of the table, tracking a slight wobble in the crystal vase holding imported black calla lilies. "You were summoned here to settle an outstanding liability, Captain." Richard Lawson began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone designed to dominate courtrooms. He slid a thick leather-bound folder across the white quartz expanse. It stopped exactly 3 inches from the edge of Victoria's side of the table. "For the past 15 years, the Sterling Family Trust has carried your development, your private preparatory tutoring prior to your abrupt departure, your health care, and your logistical upkeep as a completely non-performing asset. In short, you have been an expensive luxury the estate could ill afford while managing national-level infrastructure investments." "An invoice?" Victoria said, her voice flat, devoid of any human inflection. "You brought me to Atlanta to hand me an invoice." Fiona let out a soft, melodic laugh, the champagne in her glass swirling lazily as she took a slow sip. "Let's call it a reality check, Victoria. You've been hiding out in Washington for years, pulling a bloated government security stipend, playing soldier while the rest of us actually sweat over the family's industrial portfolio. Do you have any idea what federal interest rates did to our shipping logistics sector this quarter? No, of course you don't. You're too busy sitting at a desk counting screws and checking fluid levels in some subterranean warehouse." She leaned forward, setting the crystal glass down with a sharp metallic clink against the stone table. "The family needs liquid collateral to secure the new federal defense logistics contract for the Atlantic seaboard. The Newport estate, the one grandfather left explicitly to you in that ridiculous senile codicil, is currently sitting empty. It's an unproductive piece of rock. We need you to sign the quitclaim deed and the title transfer over to Sterling Holdings immediately. Consider it your retroactive buy-in for 15 years of unearned family privilege." "Grandfather's house is not an asset of Sterling Holdings," Victoria stated calmly, her voice matching the coldness of the room. "It was deeded to me through his personal estate after his retirement from the Joint Chiefs. It has nothing to do with your corporate debt." Julian Sterling slammed his palm onto the table, the massive ice bucket holding the champagne rattling violently against the quartzite. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson, his eyes widening with an anger that had been simmering for years. "It has everything to do with this family, Victoria. Julian roared, his voice echoing off the reinforced glass walls.
Do not take that detached military tone with us. You stand there covered in ribbons you probably earned for filling out supply manifests, in triplicate looking down your nose at the people who gave you your very name. Your sister is operating at the highest levels of federal capital allocation. She is talking to senators, to undersecretaries of defense. And you are a glorified parts clerk who refuses to throw her grain of salt into the family storehouse when the winter comes.
He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a venomous hiss.
If you do not sign those papers right now, Richard has full authorization to launch a coordinated media campaign through our defense sector trade journals. We have psychological evaluations from your initial enlistment profiles that can easily be framed as highly unstable, detached from reality, and suffering from acute operational trauma. We will make your quiet little supply job in Washington completely unlivable. You will be facing an administrative review board for clearance revocation before the week is out. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight, the psychological pressure designed to mimic a high-altitude decompression event. Inside her chest, the old familiar heat tried to rise, the burning white-hot anger of the 18-year-old girl who had watched her dreams get shredded into ash. But Victoria didn't let the heat touch her throat. Instead, she initiated her tactical breathing cycle, a habit forged in the extreme G-forces of advanced flight training and perfected in the pitch-black sky over the Malacca Strait. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. With each completion of the box, she felt her pulse settle, locking flat at exactly 60 beats per minute. Her heart rate monitor, ticking silently beneath her heavy wool jacket, would have shown a perfectly horizontal line. Her mind became a cold, high-resolution sensor array. She looked at her father and her stepmother, and she didn't see parents. She saw an unstable airframe vibrating toward a catastrophic structural failure. She remained completely silent, letting the vacuum of her silence pull them deeper into their own trap.
The federal courtroom within the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia did not feature the polished quartzite or the sound-dampening silk panels of the obsidian arch. It was a cavernous hall constructed from cold institutional granite and heavy weathered oak. The room smelled permanently of age of ink, ozone, old paper, and the absolute unyielding authority of the federal government. High above the judge's bench, the great bronze seal of the United States loomed like a massive, unblinking eye casting a long shadow over the proceedings below. Senior District Judge Harold Bennett, a legendary iron-willed figure in federal procurement law and a designated jurist for the Defense Logistics Agency's Oversight Committee, sat motionless behind his elevated bench. His face was a map of weathered stone carved by 40 years of navigating the complex, often treacherous intersections of corporate defense contracting and national security. Before him on the bench lay a thick, heavily secured document courier pouch. It was bound in heavy waterproof canvas, secured with a tamper-evident titanium locking bar, and stenciled with a stark, red ink designation, Mark 10 Special Access / Proprietary Procurement Overwatch. Inside was a single high-density secure flash drive containing a heavily encrypted file labeled simply as scenario_17.docx. Below the bench, the physical division of the courtroom spoke volumes. On the left side sat the Sterling family. Cassandra Sterling looked as though she had been chiseled from marble, her jaw set so tightly the muscles in her neck tautened beneath her white designer suit. Beside her, Fiona was frantically tapping on an encrypted satellite phone, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as her screen flashed a succession of red network error codes. Richard Lawson sat next to them, his sharp predatory posture entirely gone. His expensive suit now looked a size too large for him, his collar damp with a cold sweat that had been drying since the Office of Special Investigations raided his firm's local office 3 hours prior. On the right side of the aisle stood Victoria. She had not removed her service cap. She stood at the center podium, her posture a perfect vertical axis, her scuffed salt and fuel-crusted combat boots anchored firmly to the linoleum floor. She looked entirely separate from the panic radiating from her family, her expression as calm and unreadable as the sky before a midnight freeze.
Mr. Lawson.
Judge Bennett began, his voice a low rumbling bass that vibrated the heavy oak railings of the courtroom. Your firm filed an emergency petition to halt a federal asset freeze and to compel the immediate administrative transfer of real property from a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. You cited family governance corporate default vulnerability and a purported breach of fiduciary duty by Captain Victoria Sterling. Is that correct? Lawson stood up, his voice cracking slightly before he caught his footing.
Yes, Your Honor. The family's defense aerospace sector, Sterling Aviation Dynamics, faces an imminent liquidity crisis that threatens a major federal fleet supply chain. The property in Newport is family land wrongfully withheld by the defendant. Her refusal to sign the transfer protocol constitutes a direct malicious sabotage of an essential national security contractor.
Judge Bennett didn't look at Lawson. He picked up a heavy black digital stylus and touched the screen of his terminal, entering a 90-character cryptographic key that had been transmitted to him directly from the Pentagon via a secure courier. On the massive 60-foot digital display wall behind the witness stand, the contents of scenario_17.docx began to decrypt. The screen flickered, transitioning from a black terminal screen to a brilliant, terrifying layout of digital watermarks, active network stencils, and at the bottom of the document an active, pulsing gold cryptographic signature. The indifference on Judge Bennett's face vanished instantly. The seasoned jurist froze, his eyes widening as they scanned the electronic stencils. He leaned forward so abruptly that his heavy gavel rolled off its block, clattering loudly against the oak bench. His breath caught audibly in his microphone, a sharp, ragged gasp that made the court reporter look up in shock. He wasn't looking at a standard corporate contract. He was looking at a document that possessed a classification level so high it technically bypassed the standard Department of Justice oversight entirely. The signature at the bottom of the digital manifest did not read Captain Victoria Sterling. It read, Colonel 5 Sterling, Commanding Officer Night Systems Command /Sapphire Eye Matrix Detached. Judge Bennett slowly took off his reading glasses, his hands shaking with an emotion that had nothing to do with corporate law. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes passing completely over Cassandra, over the trembling Fiona, and locked directly onto Victoria. The silence in the courtroom grew so thick it felt suffocating. Slowly, deliberately, the 72-year-old federal judge stood up from his leather chair. He did not look at his notes. He walked around the high bench, descending the steps to the courtroom floor, an unprecedented breach of judicial protocol that caused Richard Lawson to take a step back in sheer bewilderment. Judge Bennett stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Victoria's podium. He drew his shoulders back, brought his feet together until his heels clicked, and raised his right hand to his brow, executing a textbook trembling and deeply reverent military salute. The court recognizes the presence of the commander. Judge Bennett said, his voice thick with a raw, breaking emotion that stunned every civilian in the room into absolute silence. Colonel Sterling, on November 12th, 2024, a specialized maritime intelligence unit was compromised and bleeding out on a vessel in the Malacca Strait. The team leader, who was pulled from that burning helipad by a single blacked-out stealth airframe, that was Captain Marcus Bennett, my only son. A low collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Bennett's hand remained at his brow, his eyes shining with tears he didn't care to wipe away.
For nearly 2 years, my family has looked at a blank space in the National Archive, unable to find the pilot who flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire when every other asset was grounded by the squall. They told me the file was a ghost. They told me the pilot didn't exist.
He slowly lowered his salute, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper.
The world may not know your name, Colonel, but this court knows. And my family will never forget.
Cassandra. Sterling's breath hissed through her teeth as if she had been struck with a whip. She bolted upright from her chair, her face contorting into an ugly, desperate mask.
Your Honor, this is a grotesque conflict of interest. This woman is an imposter. She is a logistics assistant, a runaway who was cast out of my home for instability. She has forged those credentials.
Sit down, Mrs. Sterling, Judge Bennett roared, turning on her with a fury that made the courtroom marshals instantly step toward the plaintiff's table, their hands resting flat against their sidearms.
One more word from you without my permission, and I will have you held in federal custody for contempt before you can take another breath.
He turned back to Victoria, his expression softening into profound respect.
Colonel Sterling, your counsel has the floor.
Victoria nodded once, a microscopic tilt of her service cap.
Thank you, Your Honor.
The defense activates the Public Disclosure Protocol under the Federal Procurement Fraud Act. Beside Victoria, her military defense counsel, a sharp-eyed captain from the Air Force. Judge Advocate General's Corps stepped to the podium and struck a key on his terminal. The digital display wall shifted instantly, the document closing to reveal a dual-layered financial ledger that stretched back 6 years, extracted straight from the hidden data blocks of scenario_17.docx.
Let the record show.
The JAG attorney announced, his voice echoing with cold forensic precision, that while Sterling Holdings and Cassandra Sterling have spent the last decade characterizing Colonel Sterling as an unproductive asset and an overhead expense, the reality is mathematically reversed. We have extracted the true unredacted transaction history from the encrypted accounts linked to the Sterling Family Trust. The screen zoomed in on a line item dated November 14th, 2020. In 2020, the attorney read, Mrs. Cassandra Sterling faced a confidential federal tax lien on the primary estate for unpaid luxury asset revenues totaling $50,000. Failure to settle would have resulted in an immediate public asset seizure during a critical shareholder meeting. This debt was settled in full via an anonymous wire transfer originating from a military banking facility. That money was drawn directly from the combat hazard and imminent danger pay accumulated by then-Lieutenant Victoria Sterling during her night operations deployments. Cassandra stared at the screen, her lips turning the color of ash. Her fingers clutched her luxury purse so hard the material groaned.
Moving forward to July 2023.
The attorney continued, his voice relentless as he scrolled down the ledger. Miss Fiona Sterling was named as a primary target in a corporate fraud investigation by the state of Ohio regarding the illegal diversion of state commercial grants. To prevent a public indictment that would have shattered the family's credit rating, a bond of $85,000 was deposited with the state treasury. That bond was secured using the Military Honor Trust account belonging to Colonel Sterling funds she had accumulated under her black budget hazard allowances.
That's a lie!
Fiona shrieked, her voice cracking as she jumped to her feet, her glass of champagne slipping from her fingers and shattering against the granite floor, the expensive liquid pooling around her designer heels.
She didn't save me. She's a thief. She stole those files. The electronic signatures do not lie, Miss Sterling.
Judge Bennett said, his voice cold enough to freeze water.
They are verified by the Federal Reserve's secure network. Every dollar you use to maintain your luxury lifestyle while calling your sister a parasite was paid for with the blood money she earned in blacked-out skies, you wouldn't survive for 10 minutes. But that is not the reason we are here today."
Victoria spoke, her voice finally breaking her silence, cutting through Fiona's hysterics like a sonic boom. She stepped closer to the display screen, her fingers tracking the data fields of the docx file that remained active at the core of the system.
3 months ago,
Victoria said, looking directly into Cassandra's panicked eyes. Sterling Aviation Dynamics submitted a critical bid for the Mark 10 Federal Fleet Supply contract. To meet the material criteria, Fiona Sterling authorized the procurement of a specific advanced optical fiber composite for the Hantum Fleet's automated sensor suites. You attempted to use my grandfather's Newport estate as equity to clear the final financial vetting for that bid. She tapped the screen. The document unfolded further, revealing a series of high-resolution metallurgic scans and customs manifests watermarked by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS.
"The material you actually bought,"
Victoria whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying weight, was a counterfeit substandard fiber optic alloy smuggled through a shell corporation. It is a material that undergoes complete signal degradation when exposed to the high-vibration, high-pressure environments of frontline naval and aerial operations. You didn't just commit procurement fraud, Fiona. You introduced an intentional blind spot into the frontline reconnaissance fleet of the United States military to pad your profit margin by $4 million.
No, that was a supplier error,"
Lawson stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to pack his documents into his briefcase.
"We have a cure period. We can replace the material." "There is no cure period for treason, Mr. Lawson,"
Victoria said coldly.
"As the superior officer commanding the Regional Procurement Overwatch Detachment under the Sapphire Eye Matrix, I have already executed the final administrative order contained within this secure DocX manifest."
She pointed to the flashing gold seal on the screen. Effective at 0800 hours this morning, Sterling Aviation Dynamics has been permanently blacklisted on the Federal Excluded Parties List system. Your manufacturing facilities are currently being cordoned off by federal agents. Your corporate digital infrastructure has been locked down under an emergency national security freeze. The bidding rights for the fleet supply contract are officially revoked, and all assets belonging to Sterling Holdings have been placed into a federal receivership pending a grand jury indictment for defense sabotage. The courtroom doors behind them burst open with a loud, violent slam. 6 federal marshals, accompanied by agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, wearing black tactical vests, poured into the room. They didn't hesitate. They bypassed the defense table entirely and swarmed the plaintiff's side of the aisle. Cassandra began to scream as an agent grabbed her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back and clicking the steel cuff tightly over her skin. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. "Julian, do something. Tell them who we are. Tell them." Julian Sterling didn't move. He sat frozen in his chair, his face completely pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the gold wings on Victoria's chest. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time he saw the terrifying, unyielding power of the weapon they had spent 18 years trying to discard. Victoria stood perfectly still, her pulse remaining locked at 60 beats per minute, her expression entirely serene as the shadows of the courtroom seal fell across her face.
"A family builds things that last, Cassandra,"
Victoria said softly, her voice echoing into the empty space left by their impending departure.
"You just built a cage. I simply turned the key."
The vacuum left by a collapsing empire doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it begins with the frantic wet slide of a zipper. Inside the VIP obsidian arch courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from calculated corporate intimidation to the absolute freezing weight of a federal counter-espionage trap. Richard Lawson, a man who had built a 35-year legacy on Wall Street by turning federal regulations into silk ribbons for the ultra-wealthy, felt the world drop away beneath his custom-tailored Oxfords. His eyes remained glued to the 60-foot digital display wall behind the witness stand. The golden cryptographic seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency pulsed with a steady rhythmic light, casting a pale glow over the faces of the Sterling family. It was an active sovereign security matrix. And sitting at the absolute center of it, watermarked with absolute clearance tokens, was the name of the girl they had spent 15 years treating as an expensive piece of trash. Colonel V. Sterling. Lawson's hand, usually steady enough to sign away multi-million-dollar maritime fleets without a tremor, began to shake. He didn't look at Cassandra. He didn't look at Julian or Fiona. His primal predatory survival instincts, honed through decades of corporate warfare, took complete control of his body. He knew exactly what that gold seal meant. It meant that every document his firm had prepared to squeeze Victoria out of her grandfather's Newport estate was now classified as a hostile action against a Tier 1 national security asset. It meant a non-bailable federal warrant. It meant the absolute end of his life. Without uttering a single word, Lawson lunged across the black quartzite table. His hands flew with a chaotic, uncharacteristic panic, sweeping up his unfiled motions, his encrypted hard drives, and his private ledgers. The heavy linen papers crinkled violently under his sweating palms, some tearing at the edges as he jammed them carelessly into his custom matte black leather briefcase. His expensive fountain pen, the one he had clicked with such effortless, dismissive arrogance just 20 minutes prior, slid off the slick stone surface and clattered loudly against the floor. He didn't even look down to find it. "Richard! Richard, what are you doing?" Cassandra Sterling's voice lost its smooth, aristocratic purr. It rose into a sharp, brittle pitch that cut through the low hum of the room's ventilation. She reached out her manicured fingers, clawing desperately at the sharp sleeve of his pinstripe jacket. "The cross-examination. You haven't even challenged her deployment logs yet." "Richard, sit down." Lawson wrenched his arm away from her grip with a violent, animalistic jerk. He finally looked at her, but his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely hollow. "This mediation is dead, Cassandra." Lawson hissed, his voice dropping into a ragged, desperate whisper that barely carried across the table. He slammed the heavy brass locks of his briefcase shut with two sharp metallic clacks. "Your stepdaughter isn't an administrative clerk at a supply depot. She is the commanding officer of Night Systems Command under a sovereign DIA wrapper. Do you have any idea what you've done? You brought my firm into an active national defense sabotage investigation. Attempting to leverage an officer of her classification level is a treasonous offense. I am withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately." "You can't leave us!" Fiona shouted, her voice cracking as she slammed her hands onto the table. "We pay your retainer. You answer to Sterling Holdings." "There is no Sterling Holdings anymore, you idiot!" Lawson whispered, his face turning a translucent shade of gray. He didn't wait for a response. Turning on his heel, the high-priced fixer of the corporate elite practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom. He hit the heavy, swinging oak doors with his shoulder, forcing them open so hard they slammed against the marble walls outside. He fled down the corridor toward the private elevators, abandoning the family to the unyielding mechanical jaws of federal justice without a single backward glance. The silence that followed the lawyer's flight was absolute, heavy and thick with the scent of ozone. The Sterling family sat isolated on their side of the aisle, stripped of their legal armor, looking suddenly small against the towering granite walls of the federal courtroom. Then came the thud. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open again, but this time they did not slide. They were driven back by the weight of 4 fully equipped agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS. They moved past the spectator rail with the terrifying synchronized economy of a military assault team. Their black tactical vests were emblazoned with bold white federal lettering that caught the harsh glare of the ceiling lights. Sidearms were holstered but ready. Their faces were completely blank, devoid of any human empathy or hesitation. They didn't pause at the podium. They bypassed the empty defense table entirely and swarmed the plaintiff's side of the aisle, instantly cordoning off every escape vector. "Fiona Sterling," the lead agent announced, his voice a flat mechanical drone that echoed off the high ceiling. He reached behind his back, drawing a pair of blackened steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The heavy metal links rang out with a cold, clear chime that signaled the end of her freedom. "You are under arrest for first-degree federal procurement fraud, corporate espionage, and the intentional sabotage of national defense equipment under Title 18 of the United States Code." "No, get away from me, Dad! Tell them to get away from me!" Fiona shrieked. The fluid, casual arrogance she had displayed while sipping vintage Krug champagne in the Obsidian Arch suite vanished in a fraction of a second. As an agent stepped forward and wrapped a gloved hand around her wrist, she panicked, her designer heels slipping violently on the polished floor. She went down hard, her knees striking the base of the oak witness stand with a dull, hollow thunk. Her ivory silk trousers instantly soaked through with the spilled, shattered remains of her drinks. Click, clack. The steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists, the ratchet teeth biting into her skin. The biting cold of the metal seemed to shock her entire nervous system, instantly breaking through her delusion of corporate immunity. She was no longer a high-flying chief executive officer dictating terms to the federal government. She was a terrified, weeping child huddled on the floor, her manicured fingers twisting uselessly against the steel chain.
"Mom, Dad, stop them! They can't do this to me!"
Fiona wailed, her voice echoing with a raw, ugly terror. "I run the capital allocation. I run the network." Beside her, Cassandra and Julian Sterling remained completely frozen in their chairs, turned to stone by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the reality crashing down upon them. Julian's face looked like old weathered parchment, his mouth hanging slack as his eyes moved from his weeping daughter on the floor up to the towering figure of Victoria. The daughter they had dismissed as a financial drain, the girl they had mocked as a glorified parts clerk who spent her days counting screws in a dusty warehouse, was currently standing before them as the absolute hand of the state. She held the power of complete financial and personal erasure over every asset, every contract, and every legacy they had spent their lives manipulating. And she hadn't even had to raise her voice to do it. Cassandra's aristocratic composure did not just crack, it shattered into a pathetic, desperate display of human terror. The woman who had spent 18 years systematically starving Victoria's spirit, the woman who had watched her husband's firstborn child walk out into a freezing coastal storm without a shred of pity, completely lost her grip on her identity. Dropping her luxury leather purse onto the stained floor, the matriarch of the Sterling family sank onto her knees. She crawled forward 2 agonizing steps across the linoleum, her expensive designer suit dragging through the dirt and debris until she was quivering directly beneath the heavy scuffed leather of Victoria's combat boots. "Victoria, please." Cassandra sobbed, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. She looked up, her face twisted into an unrecognizable mask of desperation, her tears tracking long, dark lines through her heavy makeup. Her hands hovered inches from Victoria's uniform trousers, trembling violently, too terrified to actually make contact. "She's your sister. She's just a girl, Victoria." She didn't understand the technical specifications of the fiber optics. She was just trying to balance the quarterly budget for the firm. "Use your clearance, Victoria. Please, call them off." You have the DIA tokens. You can freeze the indictment. Please, for the sake of the sterling name. For your father's heart. Victoria looked down at her stepmother. Her blue eyes were entirely flat dark and deep, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights like the surface of a frozen Atlantic bay. Her pulse remained perfectly chillingly locked at 60 beats per minute. She didn't pull her boot away from Cassandra's proximity, nor did she lean into the explosive emotion of the request. She simply stood there, an unyielding pillar of absolute military authority, letting the vacuum of her silence pull the remaining air out of the room. Slowly, deliberately, Victoria reached up and adjusted the alignment of her service cap, ensuring the embroidered silver Air Force Eagle sat perfectly level and centered above her brow.
I don't negotiate with corporate parasites, Cassandra, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a quiet, terrifyingly resonant register that cut cleanly through Fiona's distant hysterical wailing. And I certainly don't negotiate with traders who trade the structural integrity of American reconnaissance fleets for a $4 million profit margin. The sterling name didn't belong to you, it belonged to my grandfather, and he would have ordered the firing squad himself. She stepped backward smoothly, disengaging her space from Cassandra's trembling, reaching fingers. The invoice for your arrogance has finally come due, Cassandra. It's fully itemized and the interest is non-negotiable. Live with it. Victoria turned her back on them for the final time. As she walked toward the side exit of the courtroom, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out from the shadows of the gallery to meet her. It was Daniel. He wore no uniform, just a rugged dark canvas jacket and heavy work jeans, but his hands bore the distinct thick calluses of a veteran metropolitan firefighter. He had stood in the back of the room for hours, silent, unblinking, acting as her emotional anchor while she dismantled her past. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply stepped into stride beside her, his massive, warm hand sliding into hers, his fingers locking between her calloused knuckles with an unspoken promise that had been kept through every night deployment, every blackout, and every storm. Together they walked through the secure exit doors, leaving the screams of the dying dynasty behind them in the dark. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass pavilion of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., illuminating the sweeping, majestic lines of aviation history suspended in the air. The vast space was filled with the low, pleasant murmur of tourists, the distant laughter of school children, and the ambient, peaceful hum of a capital city moving forward. Victoria walked slowly beneath the immense dark belly of a legendary strategic bomber, her steps light, measured, and unhurried. She was entirely out of uniform, wearing a tailored emerald green wool trench coat over soft denim, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. The sharp, hyper-vigilant tension that had defined her posture for 2 decades had finally softened into something beautiful, relaxed, and deeply grounded. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the tiny, warm hand of a 3-year-old girl named Lily. Lily had Fiona's bright green eyes, but none of her mother's learned malice or inherited cruelty. After the federal courts had finished liquidating Sterling Aviation Dynamics, Cassandra and Fiona had been sentenced to 12 and 15 years respectively in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Fiona's husband, a hedge fund manager, who had married into the family solely to leverage their capital network, had filed for divorce within 48 hours of the indictment, abandoning the infant Lily to the state, before fleeing to a non-extradition territory in South America. The Sterling dynasty had vanished into the dirt of their own greed. But Victoria had returned to the wreckage one last time, not for the real estate, not for the billions in frozen offshore accounts, but to pull this single innocent life out of the ashes. She had legally adopted Lily within a month of the trial's conclusion, breaking the cycle of emotional starvation before it could touch another generation.
Look, Mommy Tori! Look at the big silver bird!
Lily chirped, pointing her small finger up at the sharp black nose of an old special operations helicopter suspended from the steel rafters above them. Victoria stopped looking up at the machine. It was a decommissioned MH-60M Pavehawk, the exact stealth model she had flown through the narrow, fiery channels of the Malacca Strait. The sun caught the clean plexiglass of the cockpit, rendering it bright clear and perfectly still. Daniel stepped up beside them, carrying 2 small boxes of apple juice and a camera. He wrapped his free arm tightly around Victoria's waist, pulling her close against his chest. He smelled of cedarwood, clean outdoor air, and home. "She looks just like you when she looks at the sky," Daniel whispered, kissing the top of Victoria's head. Victoria smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She looked down at Lily, then back up at the open, sun-drenched pavilion of the museum. There were no black budgets here. There were no corporate invoices, no gold leaf cages, and no cold calculating stepmothers trying to clip her wings. She had faced the saltwater exile, endured the hell of the training fields, and executed a flawless surgical reckoning against the people who had tried to erase her existence. And now, standing beneath the open sky with her husband and the child she had saved, Victoria Sterling was finally completely and permanently free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.